Okay, can you all hear me? Yes. Okay, so we're going to talk for about 50 minutes in the formal way up here. And then after that 50 minutes expires, we're going to open it up to questions from all of you. So be prepared. We want many questions because, as I said, this is such an important topic. So let's start with the headline in the Washington Post, shall we? 300,000 voters purged from the rolls in Georgia. Ohio and Wisconsin did similar things. What exactly do you think is going on, Kathay?
We now know that there has been a concerted effort to link a number of different issues around voter access and redistricting to limit who can actually cast a ballot and have a meaningful vote. Unfortunately, that strategy is tied to trying to secure a partisan advantage or an advantage for a particular incumbent. And the concern is that in doing so, we do irreparable harm to our democracy at large. When hundreds of thousands of people are turned away, or when the laws are changed last minute in order to ensure that certain people who have always been eligible to vote suddenly have to cross 2 or 3 barriers in order to cast a ballot, or when redistricting is done in a way that manipulates the lines to give a benefit to one party or one incumbent, we are distorting our democracy. And
well, I'm gonna
clearly
push back.
is a part of a political strategy.
I just want to push back because critics do say it's a political strategy. The secretaries of state in Wisconsin, Georgia, and Ohio are all Republicans, just so you know, but they say that they are just purging people who have died from the rolls and makes it much more expensive to have people who are ineligible to vote on the rolls. So what's wrong with that?
So the way that we do it in California, I think, is the right way, which is that we do actively look through the list to make sure that if somebody has moved or if somebody has passed away, that those lists are updated by comparing them to other statewide databases or even federal databases. But the key thing is that we also give voters or their families the opportunity to respond and let us know, hey, actually, there might be a little bit of a glitch. This name is the same as that name. We're still alive. We still live here. Or maybe we just moved, but we haven't updated. There's plenty of reasons why people are legitimately allowed to vote. They need to be on the lists, but when they're taken off, all of a sudden, their right to vote has been fundamentally denied. And that's the biggest challenge, is that the way that those lists are being cleaned is having a disparate impact on certain populations, generally people who are younger, people who don't own their homes, who are apartment dwellers, and certainly people of color. And all of that seems to be targeted very clearly at people who also vote a certain way in order to affect the election outcome.
Does it also affect the disabled community, these voter purges?
I think particularly because people with disabilities have they fall into these categories, right? So people who tend to be apartment dwellers or who might have their records in some way sort of last name similar to somebody else's last name, they tend to fall into the same categories of people who are disparately impacted.
Critics also say that the purges involve people who haven't voted in elections for 7 years. So they kick those people off the voting rolls because they figure they're just not interested, or they've moved out of the state, or they can't find them, or they haven't responded. And again, they would say, why should these people be on the voter rolls costing the state money if they're not exercising their right to vote? And they haven't for 7 or 8 years.
The U.S. Constitution protects the right to vote to every single person. It does not matter whether you are active or you've decided to take a break. You may have all sorts of reasons for not voting in certain years because the candidates weren't appealing, life happened and you had a baby, right? You've moved, you know, things are tough. That is no reason to remove somebody from the rolls. And in fact, I think some of the protections that California has created really, I think, set the standard for what the country should be doing.
Tell us about the protections in California.
Yeah. You want to be able to look at current records from various databases to see whether or not things need to be updated. So people go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, for instance, because they're updating their license, and they might update their address or even their last name or other things, their status. That's the kind of thing that you'll want to constantly compare to. And in fact, actually, California has created a very active process of comparing those records. But again, before you remove somebody from any voter roll, you want to contact that voter and give them multiple opportunities to be able to indicate if we got it right or got it wrong. We have seen in states like Georgia, they've tried to remove hundreds of thousands of voters, and it turned out that other than in a very few number of cases, they got it wrong. And so they were about to disenfranchise several 100,000 voters all on almost a whim. And really, it's ultimately the voter's right to hold on to that ability to cast a ballot. And we need to always give that power and that right back to the voter to remove themselves if they want to, but not to be removed when they are still active and eligible voters.
And just to back up what you said, in the state of Ohio, they purged more than 200,000 from the rolls, but then they opened it up to the public. So advocacy groups went through the list, and they found 40,000 of those voters were indeed eligible to vote. So they were reinstated. So mistakes do happen, and there needs to be some sort of watchdog in place to make sure that everything's kosher.
I mean, there's plenty of people who will have similar names. Astrid, Ochoa, you might find somebody who has a similar name who even is of similar age or even, similar birthday. And what I'll say is that our registrars here in California, I talk regularly to Dean Logan and Neil Kelly from Orange County and Los Angeles County, and what they say is that they spend a lot of detailed time looking to make sure that before anybody is removed, that they got it right. So even if you've got a similar name, even if you share a similar birthday, I want to be absolutely sure that if somebody's going to be removed from the registration lists, that it's because they actually have moved or have passed away or in some other way need to be removed.
And in talking about exact match signatures, right, that has to affect the disabled community, because if you have trouble writing, somebody might not be able to determine if that's exactly your signature, right?
Yeah, so our election officials here in California actually do a really great job of giving voters the benefit of the doubt, and there have been recent laws that require contacting that voter and giving them a chance to fix that signature. And so that is part of the process where, as Kathy mentioned, life circumstances change for everybody, and where you might be an avid voter one year, the next year you may not. And the more options we give voters to be able to participate in our democracy, regardless of where they are in their life, the more we're going to get those opportunities to engage voters. And so, yes, I had a baby 2 years ago, and I was able to become a permanent vote-by-mail voter. So I still got to participate, even though I couldn't make it to the polls on election day. And now with the transition to vote centers here in California, to vote centers to 15 counties here in California, including Los Angeles County, you can now vote on the weekends as well, up to 10 days before election day. So the more options voters have, and the more election administration meets the needs of voters, the more opportunities you create for voting.
Yeah, and just, jump in. Please, if you have something fabulous to say, jump in, because I want this to be more of a conversation than an interrogation by me, even though I enjoy that. I was thinking as I was doing research on this topic that people who are disabled, minorities, LGBTQ people, trans people, people with language barriers, together these voters number in the tens of millions. And yet so many feel disenfranchised, and so many are disenfranchised. I suspect we all have an idea of why this is, but I'd like each of you to tell me why you think this is. So I'll start at the end.
So first and foremost, I think I need to start with saying that people with disabilities are everywhere, and it's not just the disabled voter, it's the people around them, it's the people in their community and their families, and to say that just the disabled voter is this kind of voter is completely inaccurate and untrue. And I think, looking at us all up here today, of course we have different specialties. I work within people with disabilities and securing the right to vote, but the intersections of what all we do, everybody feels disenfranchised, whether whether they identify as having disability, within LGBTQ, person of color. So to say that a person with a disability as a voter feels disenfranchised for one reason, that is not something that I can say because or I can answer to that effect because it's that person's own feeling and own reasoning. I can talk endlessly about the physical barriers and the attitudinal barriers that prevent people from registering and from casting a ballot. But to feel disenfranchised, I think the only thing I can really comment on is if you're not invited to the table, you don't want to vote. And so having that lack of access at the ballot or registering, that I can say is a reaping.
Well, when you think of deliberate efforts to disenfranchise people who are disabled, who are among our most vulnerable voters, that's kind of despicable, right? So is it all about power from those who are doing the disenfranchising, or is it more than that?
So I've thought a lot in the last couple of days about, is there any concerted effort to purposely disenfranchise the disabled vote? We can see there are certain other types of voters who are, it's very clearly, it's fact that they are being disenfranchised. And I could not answer that question to say, are people with disabilities and the disabled vote being purposefully barred? And it is within our own culture. It's just, we're not there yet. And I'm not entirely sure how to bring around this answer, but I know they can definitely speak, these ladies can speak much more to that.
I think Elizabeth brings up a good point, which is that a voter is a voter, and then somebody who has a disability is something that sort of sometimes you may be born with and sometimes it comes along. I'm sitting here with glasses that I now need to use to read anything. And so in order to vote.
That's an accommodation.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
an accommodation.
And that is a disability because as I go to vote, if the print is written in something that's too small or without high enough contrast, I can no longer see the ballot. So I think thinking about people who have different kinds of, they're coming to the vote with different kinds of abilities is important. Let me take a step back and just say I think that in the past in California, but also in many states, election systems have been set up from the perspective of those who are abled and from the perspective of those who've always voted in the past. And so whether that is tied to a discriminatory intent or not, the impact is that it can have the effect of excluding certain people. Okay, and I'll say in some places there is intent. But I will say that in places like California, for instance, in Los Angeles, we continue to use a voting system where you have to insert a paper ballot into a little device and manually flip the pages in order to line up the candidate names with a marking device. That's a challenge on a number of different levels. Somebody who can't manually manage that ballot, somebody who does not read English, which is a gigantic population, will have to have a sample ballot that's translated and then try to match the candidate names and the ballot names. So right there, if you mismark by one bubble, you're off entirely. Your ballot is entirely off. And that's the kind of barrier that when you multiply that by hundreds of thousands, it can have a huge effect on the election. Now, to the question of whether or not there are active efforts to exclude, I'll speak from my own personal perspective as a woman of Asian American descent, that there has been clearly a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric. And we have seen in recent election protection efforts where we run hotlines to receive voters who are calling in to ask questions about, where's my polling place? And, can you verify whether or not I can cast a ballot? that we are increasingly getting phone calls in about people who are actively trying to intimidate voters from casting a ballot based on their assessment about whether they are legitimate voters. And that might be, hey, is your skin too dark? Do you speak with an accent? Do you look like you're Mexican or any other immigrant that is not a legitimate voter? Okay, and actively using their position of power, whether that's outside of the polling place or sometimes even sneaking in and getting in to become a poll worker and making distinctions and asking people illegitimately to show papers or show some kind of proof that they're allowed to be there. They do that for all voters. They do that for voters who they deem to be not legitimate. That is becoming increasingly, I will call those vigilantes, permitted because of the national rhetoric that's happening. Sort of a permission for people to try to use, to bring their bias and their discriminatory intent into the polling place. In California, we have jealously guarded our election process as something that's nonpartisan. And I'll say that generally speaking, we try to root that out very quickly. But it's popped up in California too.
That's just crazy. Tony, welcome. We're glad to have you as part of our panel because you have a lot of important information to share with us. Along the same lines of those questions about why disenfranchisement happens, the Costello Center poll found these extraordinary numbers that I want to share with you right now. It found the extended disability community makes up 60% of the population. Is that insane? 60%. That means a lot of disabled people are voting or could vote and wield tremendous power. 14.3 million disabled people voted in 2018. 14.3 million. That's more people, that's more than the Latino population voted. And it's just a little less than the African American population voted. That's incredible power. Like, might that be a reason for some disenfranchisement in that community?
Yeah, I wanted to add, voting is a happy thing. If you go to the polls on election day, people feel like they've accomplished something. They feel like, I have contributed to my community, I'm out here giving a voice to my community, I'm out here being seen. And when it's not happy is usually because there's been some barrier to that voter being able to cast their ballot. And my organization, we are a cross-sector, intersectional organization that brings together election officials, advocates, civil rights groups, civic engagement groups, to talk about how do we reduce barriers. To Kathay's point, the system is built by those that have perhaps a more able experience. And so when you bring together advocates for voters with disabilities, with limited English proficient voters, with election officials, you help create a system from the beginning that will serve all voters. And that's the vision, right? We don't want to create a system where then you tag on pieces so that voters can participate, but that a voter can participate however they wish, in the language they wish, with the assistive technology that they wish, independently. And that's a really important point because our systems need to change and adapt to the needs of voters to meet voters where they are. For example, we heard the point about, brought up by Secretary Bowen about paper and how that's outdated. Well, how many of you used to carry a quarter for the phone booths? And phone companies have adapted. We don't use that. And so our election system must also adapt to take advantage of the technology to make it easier for voters to meet their needs at whatever life moment they're in. And so that would help increase those opportunities to engage.
Interesting. Tony, I want to bring you into the conversation. You work to turn LGBTQ non-voters into voters in California. What are some of the barriers that people in that community feel as they go to the polls or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think, based on recent studies with the Williams Institute, LGBTQ voters are disproportionately unregistered to vote as compared to the larger population. And I think, particularly, up until recently, our community was not spoken to in the public sphere, and before that, outright hostile to our community. And I think particularly particularly on the Democratic side, candidates are really speaking to our issues. This really motivated our community to really turn out to vote. Up until 2018, the last cycle, the LGBTQ community overwhelmingly voted for the Democratic candidate. I think we were, as a community, second to the African American community in terms of Democratic voters. And I think that is really because sort of the atmosphere that we live in with the current administration attacking the community, folks really see why it is important to vote. But I think
that surprises me, because I look at the gay community as a powerful lobbying group who is very successful at getting members of that community out to vote. So.
And I think that, the community is not a monolith, right? We are a part of every single community that is out there. And I think, there is a perception that, the LGBT community is really made up of, cisgender, white, wealthy men. But obviously we are part of every single community. And I think where the gaps are where there are intersections of the LGBTQ folks, communities of color, folks that are experiencing poverty, homelessness, things like that. And that's where, for us, a lot of the barriers are. Nationwide, when these voter suppression laws are really targeting, folks of color, LGBTQ folks of color, trans folks of colors are really being disproportionately impacted, because you're looking at poverty, discrimination, bureaucracy. When you need a photo ID law, if your photo ID does not match your gender identity, you can't vote, right? Same with if you are, experiencing the criminal justice system. You've been incarcerated for things like sex work or HIV criminalization, you're not allowed to vote in certain states. If you're, even here in California, even though the laws are really great in terms of voter access, the experience, particularly for trans folks, gender nonconforming folks, that, a poll worker is asking for their ID, if they don't present in the same gender expression as what's listed on the voter rolls, a lot of folks don't want to go into the voting booth to exercise their right to vote, because they don't want to, feel that, not so much discrimination, but perhaps, ignorance in terms of how do we make the voting booth more inclusive of LGBTQ folks.
So when you approach potential voters, how do you convince them to go vote?
Yeah, I think it's, talking to folks of where they're at. For us specifically, even though California, in terms of legal rights, we have a lot of great things. Looking at the national level, talking about why it's important to extend federal non-discrimination protections. People don't know that you can get fired just for being LGBTQ. In many states, there are no federal protections. Talking about, the onslaughts in terms of, the transgender military ban, things like that, that are really affecting our community, and using those hooks to encourage them to turn out, in November.
I want to touch a second on the American with Disabilities Act, because certain things had to be put in place by law at polling places to make it easier for disabled people to vote. Right now in the state of Georgia, that law is being used, critics allege, to turn people away from the polls, especially in largely African American districts. They're using the ADA to say, well, it's not up to code, so we're going to close them down. So in one largely African American county in Georgia, they closed 7 of 9 polling places. Now, the thing is, there were violations of the law. So how do you fix that problem, Elizabeth?
Could you be a little bit more specific on fixing which
problem?
There's multiple
well,
problems.
It's interesting that that people who allegedly want to disenfranchise African American voters are using the Americans with Disabilities Act to accomplish that. Your thoughts on that?
So, since the ADA was introduced, there has always been an opposition to try to dismantle the ADA in some fashion, to say that that we just can't be accessible for XYZ reason. And I think that it was strategic within Georgia to do that, to use the ADA, claiming that things are inaccessible, and so we're going to put up our hands and say no. It was a scapegoat, and unfortunately, people with disabilities have been used as that scapegoat, saying that our accessibility and our need and our right to access is a burden on somebody else. The way that I would try to go about fixing that is going back to square one and saying, this is what's in the law, these are the regulations, this is the code, and it depends on where you are in what county and what state, and I can talk endlessly about Orange County, but it's unfortunate that happened, but in my heart of hearts, I know that there was the approach to use the ADA was not just to disenfranchise people with disabilities. There was much more behind it.
I mean, clearly, if the intent was to not only give voters who have disabilities, but also the African American voters who lived in and around that area the ability to cast a ballot easily, what they would have done was A, bring those spaces up to compliance, or B, find a location that's still within the neighborhood that meets the requirements. If their goal is to get rid of a polling place so as to make it harder for both of those communities to cast a ballot, well, that's what they did. So I think that the intentions kind of play out from what the results are. When you find that your most maintained voting equipment, your least purged lists, your least likely to move polling places are all located in white, wealthy neighborhoods. And the ones that are moved around, closed down, have faulty equipment, and poll workers who don't know what they're doing, are all located in neighborhoods with people of color or people with disabilities or young people or LGBTQ communities. It's telling you exactly who they're targeting. The resources are moved away from communities that need it the most to the communities that are already voting. I'll just say one other thing that's an interesting dynamic that plays out in campaigns as well. So campaigns have limited dollars for who they're going to spend trying to contact voters. And so they generate these voter lists of people who vote 5 out of 5 times of 5 last elections, 4 out of 5 elections, 3 out of 5 elections, or 0 out of 5 elections. And guess who they spend most of their time talking to? They spend almost 100% of their dollars, if they've got limited dollars, talking to the people who vote 5 out of 5 times. And what that means is that consistently campaigns reinforce that division between who's talked to and who's not talked to. If you vote frequently, your mailbox is full of slate mail, and you're called like 3 times a day, and people are reminding you when the election day is and polling you on how you're feeling, and hey, do you need help getting to the polls? They know. But if you're the infrequent voter, not only are you not talked to by the campaigns, you're kind of actively left off of anybody's radar screen because they don't know how you vote. So you're an unknown factor, and so they're actively trying to keep you from participating. Add that to the fact that you might be much more likely to be purged from a list because you haven't voted very frequently, or any variety of other barriers that would prevent you from getting to the polls to vote. All of those cascade to sort of reinforce the votes and the vote nots, sort of a similar parallel to have and have nots, only we just keep reinforcing people who are the vote nots to say, you're not part of the party and we're not going to include you in that party.
In an effort to get more people to vote in the state of California, the Voters' Choice Act went into limited effect in California in 2018. It means the end polling places and the birth of voter centers. As I said, its intent is to make voting easier, to get more people to vote. Astrid, I know you had a lot to do with that. So can you give us, was it a success in your mind, what happened in 2018?
Yeah, so my organization creates a policy table for discussion. We debate, we discuss, we disagree, we argue, we come back together, and the outcome is, thankfully, better policy ideas. And so we did not take a position on the Voters' Choice Act itself, but we did create a policy table for dialogue. And the rollout in 2018 was limited. It was 5 counties in California. In 2020, it's going to be 15, representing over 50%. So to evaluate the success of a bill on such limited data, I think would be a little bit too early. What we do know is that when you increase the options for voting, which the Voters' Choice Act does, you can vote by mail, vote at a drop box. You can vote, as I mentioned, up to 10 days before Election Day and all the way through Election Day. We also have same-day registration across California, not just in the Voters' Choice Act counties, and also we now have no postage required for vote-by-mail ballots across California. Again, all of these items are to set up voters for success, to reduce the barriers to voting. It's really hard to get a stamp nowadays, so that's an important point, which discourages some folks from transitioning to vote by mail. And so, I think what we really need to see is how does this policy cut across the board, right? So how does it serve voters with disabilities? How does it serve limited English proficient voters? And one of the great features of the Voters' Choice Act is that it encourages public engagement. And so for the first time, voters are invited to help shape their election administration plans. So after the first 2 years of an election under the Voters' Choice Act, the Elections Office will hold public comment and engage the public to see how we change it. And then every 4 years after that law, voters continue to have that opportunity to engage with their elections office. So I think that there are a lot of features that are very promising in the Voters' Choice Act in the sense that the customers that are using the service are being invited to help shape and to express how to best serve them. So I think it's really exciting to see these changes happening in California. I think 2020 will be an important year to truly give us a picture of how successful this policy is. And I just want to add one more thing, which is we just need to make sure that we fund our elections. If we're committed to democracy, we have to make sure that election officials have the resources they need to provide those excellent services.
The LA Times did a story on the participating counties in 2018. It said it only saw a 3% uptick in the number of people who voted, which doesn't sound like a lot. So I just wanted you to respond to that. And does that tell us anything, since this is
I'll
such
take a 3% uptick any day. Come on now.
want-
An uptick is an uptick.
What is it? We're at 19 million voters?
Yeah.
So
I mean,
3%
in
of
California,
7% uptick in Latino voters, young voters, and Asian American voters.
when you see a 7%, it doesn't sound like a lot, but in California, that's millions. So I'll take that. I think that every increment that we can get to get people to participate makes sense, and especially because we're now building a voting system that's thinking forward. We've had a voting system that, like, up until now is really designed, I think, kind of with the 1700s in mind, right? Like, I mean, this idea that, okay, we're gonna look at where you live, and then we're gonna assign you to a polling place that's close to where you live, you got to vote there on a single day, which is a Tuesday, which everybody's wondering, like, why, right? And these days, what I think what the recognition is let's give people a range of choices. First, when you vote, not just on a Tuesday, because we're all busy, and so my day off, if I'm working in the restaurant industry, might be Monday, right? If I'm in a certain religious community, Saturday might be the day that's my day off. Sunday might be the other. So honestly, it's giving them the whole range of that week. Okay, before. Second is, I can vote in a vote center that's close to me, or I can just get online and find, hey, I'm driving from here to work, I gotta drop off my kids, and so somewhere along the way, aha, there's a vote center there. Pop into the vote center that is on my route along the way. They can pull up all my information, voila, you can vote at that location. Maybe on a particular day, because I've got a meeting that's a little bit farther out, I'm totally off route and I'm driving to someplace that I've never been to before. Also okay to vote. Maybe I just moved and I forgot, oh my God, I didn't re-register and I didn't change that information. Again, the beauty is you can stop into a vote center, update that information instantaneously, and now you can be registered to vote. All of those things just feel right for the 21st century, and I think that they respond to, I think, where new voters and old voters are going to be demanding. We just expect that kind of on-demand ability to vote when we're ready to vote.
Well, you know, there are always doomsayers and critics. And as you said, Astrid, the real test is going to be in 2020, right? Especially in LA County with its 5.4 million voters. Critics wonder if people will be able to easily find the voting centers instead of their polling places. There are so many people and there's so much traffic, and so much confusion sometimes just over the simplest things, especially in Los Angeles, as you know.
Can I make a comment about the 3%? So I'm gonna lean back on my registrar of voters, Neil Kelly in Orange County. I'm the co-chair of the Voting Accessibility Advisory Committee, so I work closely with him and his team. And he wholeheartedly believes, and now I do too, is when that statistic came out that, oh, there's only this much voter turnout, and we all thought, those of us who are working within the voting sphere is, oh my gosh, that seems like nothing. But going back, and what Neil is telling us and telling voters in Orange County is that we're changing voting behavior by going to the vote center model. We can't expect these overwhelming numbers to say that it works and it's great, because it's a stagnated approach. It's 5 counties now, some are going hybrid, it's 15 right now. It would be great to have the entire state by 2022 or 2024, but for the 3%, with Kathay, I'll be like, heck yeah, I'll take that 3%. But I don't want to have us just focus on that and say, like, the Voters' Choice Act isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing, because it is. There are so many, Astrid touched upon the different ways to be able to cast your ballot, but there's so much within the Voters' Choice Act that we haven't even touched upon right now that are ensuring and really giving people the opportunity to cast their ballot and be involved within their elections like never before.
No, you are right. It's hard to change people's behavior. I think that with 2020 coming up and, the momentous election it will be, that people are concerned that it won't work as well.
Yeah. So how many people live in LA County? Okay. You are all now ambassadors of the Voters' Choice Act. Implementing a reform as big as the Voters' Choice Act is bigger than any one agency can take. Dean Logan, our Registrar, Recorder, County Clerk, has been a great leader in working on a transition to a voting model, frankly, for 10 years. And so this wasn't just a quick response to a change in a policy. It was a very thoughtful process to make sure that this new voting system is going to serve all LA voters, regardless of where they live, that they're going to have that opportunity. We have a very large county. We have a very complex electorate. It's not easy, and I think it's important to recognize that we all have a role in strengthening our democracy by sharing what we learn today, by connecting with other voters that are not going to take the time to learn their new voting options. And that's the vision of our network, Voters' Choice Los Angeles, that we manage. It's a nonprofit network of nonpartisan organizations working just on voter education, trying to understand how a new voting model changes GOTV, how a new voting model changes voter education, and recognizing that there's new skills that are needed, there's new partnerships that need to be formed, and that we do need the funding to do this successfully.
And, if this is successful, this could be the model for the nation, right? And that would be exciting.
We're a day off from the presidential debates, and I'm hoping that at least one of the questions is really thinking forward to ask those presidential candidates, right, each one of them, will they commit to modernizing our voting and election system so that our election process is inclusive, not exclusive, one that really thinks about people from all walks of life and how we build an election system that fundamentally embeds the idea that everybody has a right to vote, and that we're going to make every effort possible to bring people into that amazing family of people who participate and make our American democracy vibrant.
There's so much contrary information out there, because I'm sure if you asked anybody, no matter what their political stripe, they would say it's important to get people to the polls, it's important to vote, it's democracy. But there was an interesting editorial in the Wall Street Journal, and it was talking about voter suppression and what a myth it was, and this is the reason that it gave. It said Black and Latino turnout nationwide in 2018 hit a record high. Despite voter ID and new registration laws, the turnout increased 13.4% among Latinos, 11.4% for African Americans. So Republicans are saying, you guys are all a tad hysterical about this voter suppression stuff. Like, what more do you want?
Every step of the way, there has been litigation, there has been voter action, there's been pushback to try to make sure that these crazy voter suppression laws are not put into place, or that we can ameliorate the effects. And it's only because of that activism from people from every walk of life that we've been able to push back and ensure that people who want to vote can still cast a ballot. It's not for lack of some of these political operatives trying to suppress the vote. It's because the people have risen up and said, hell no, this is our right and we're going to take it. So I'll say this, to the extent that people who believe that you should institute strict voter ID laws or purge lists or use any other kind of shenanigan to manipulate the legal system so that people cannot vote, what you're going to face is Americans who stand up for and don't take for granted that ability. So thank you very much, because I think that it's woken a lot of people up to be participants.
And Tony, I also wanted you to address that, because the Wall Street Journal editorial also said Democrats picked up 40 House seats and 9 governorships. You flipped a district in California or 2. So how would you respond to them, where it's like this voter suppression stuff? Come on, what more do you want? This is amazing what you guys did.
I mean, I think it's, it's, to Kathy's point, it's all in coalition, right? I mean, I think, particularly in some of these states that are more restrictive, this was in light of those laws. It was working in coalition, with communities of color, with LGBTQ folks, people with disability, really working in coalition to sort of see what's happening and fighting back against those laws. And I think, 2018 was a good, hopefully an indicator of what's to come for 2020, and continuing to sort of exercise people's right to vote and really sort of, use their democratic right to sort of push back on these things that folks have seen that's happening.
So I'd just like to end our part of the conversation with what's going to happen in 2020, and whether voters will be enthusiastic, and what you have to look out for as people go to the polls. So, Kathy, I'll start with you.
I would be floored if 2020 didn't have record-breaking voter turnout and participation, because regardless of which side you are on the political spectrum, I think the conversation has come to a point where participation is an absolute necessity if people care about the direction that our country is going to be taking. I will say that there are a lot of advocates on the ground who've been working night and day to make sure that certain efforts to try to, for instance, weaponize the census, or to politicize redistricting, or to manipulate the voting laws to suppress votes, are really having a positive effect in pushing back on those efforts, right? And so I think that voters realize every step of the way our democracy is one that is vital and needs vigilance in order to protect it. And that starts with the very simple but universal act of registering to vote and casting a ballot. So I think a lot of people are going to show up, and we're going to see hopefully a change in the way that people approach voting, not just as a duty, or not just because, I'm going to slog through the snow or through the rain or through the bright sunshine of Los Angeles to cast a ballot, but because I actively want to take care of my country, and this is one way of showing that I care.
What are you most concerned about in 2020, Astrid?
Well, like I said, my organization is leading a project around Voters' Choice Act implementation, and of course my concern is that voters are not going to know about the new options. So my call to you and to all that live in Voters' Choice Out County is vote early. Every day is Election Day, February 22nd through March 3rd, and leave Election Day for those that are just going to be hearing about it on that day. So, we have options in California. I mentioned some of the laws. Let's take advantage of them. Let's make voting fun and bring back that spirit.
Elizabeth? Your biggest concern in 2020 as far as voting is concerned?
Similar to Astrid's point, is just the everyday voter's just not going to know the changes. And right now we're in such a delicate time where over 50% of registered voters in the state are going to be voting at a vote center, are going to be getting the vote by mail ballot, when some of them have never gotten a vote by mail before. I'm very excited, but I'm also nervous excited because it's really on us, the people who, like myself, who's in the grassroots on the ground, to tell our consumers, our community, family, everybody that this is happening and this is changing, and it's a good thing. So to be able to say these are the options, and to to go cast your ballot. And there's so many new and innovative things about our elections processes that are happening right now. I just hope that people take advantage of it and appreciate all of the blood, sweat, and tears that's gone into making this whole process happen.
Tony, your concerns?
I think, for us in 2020, ensuring keeping up the momentum created from 2018, I think, particularly at times for our community at least, folks feel that, California is a, deep blue state, with the top of the ticket, there may be some voter apathy, but, putting their vote in, vote early, and then sort of, mobilizing their broader network to volunteer, making sure they cast their ballot, because it doesn't just, obviously the White House matters, but also there's a number of important congressional seats, state house seats, local elections that are all very important, that really matter to the day-to-day lives of our community. So making sure that, folks aren't apathetic, because they feel that they're in a Democratic area.
So how do you do that? Do you walk door to door? Do you use the internet? All of the above?
All of the above. I think one thing, we have nearly 1 million members across the state where we, do physical slate cards. We hit them with digital ads. We do calls, in specific targeted areas. Social media, things like that, where we really encourage, folks to sort of, spread the word and make it really a community effort. Where folks are exercising their right together in sort of social accountability.
Okay, so now I'm going to open it up for audience questions. We'll have about 15 or 20 minutes for that. So hopefully you've had your questions ready, and I'm ready for the first one. Someone have a question?
Yes. My question is about voter education. There's a lot of information out there that is not accessible to individuals with disabilities, namely not closed captioned, or having a ASL or American Sign Language version. Many deaf people, ASL is their first language and English is their second language, so I would like to see that information translated into the native tongue, if you will, of deaf people as well. We have low vision individuals who need auditory description. So there's a lot of room for improvement in making education, voter education, more accessible to all communities.
Elizabeth, would you like to take that?
So I guess it's more of a comment. One, I am right there with you, trying to make sure that every I is dotted and T is crossed in terms of access. I've fought so hard to have open captions on our videos in Orange County. Not closed captions, open captions, and that's the kind that you can't take off. They're ingrained in the video. But there are so many nuances in what access looks like, and it means different things to different people. So I really appreciate your comment, and I would encourage any voter with a disability or anybody in the community to be able to get involved in their election administration plan with their elections office and demand that access, demand it because it is their right, and to fight for it, because if you push hard enough, they will absolutely do it.
I'll just add that for Voters' Choice Act counties, the counties are required to have committees for voters with disabilities and limited English proficient voters so that they can consult with the voters as they develop that plan. Additionally, under Secretary Bowen, we did have a state committee for voters with disabilities to really look at it from the state level, and then that was expanded to also have a state language advisory committee on language access. So there are avenues to continue advocating for these increased services, and I know I sound like a broken record, but if we really want to have the best elections, we have to fund them.
Next question.
Hi. Excuse my ignorance on this issue. The last time that I checked, I think was several years ago, so I'm wondering if you know any updates. For folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities, what is your stance on accessibility for them to vote? And I know one specific issue because it affected my sister who had a conservatorship, and through that conservatorship here in California, she was stripped of her right to vote. And then several years ago, I think either there was a law or something passed that overturned that, so folks like my sister were able to vote again. But I think they had to go in front of a judge in order to actually retrieve that right. So that's a specific thing. What's the update on sort of that policy? And then more generally, what are some of the major debates right now on the issue of getting folks with intellectual and developmental disability to be able to vote?
I can absolutely comment on the conservatorship section of it in regards to the IDD, or intellectual and developmental disability groups who are organizing around voting. I can absolutely connect you with folks who are doing that on the ground. I'm kind of a generalist, but I want to go back to the conservatorship situation, because I get that question a lot. And in California right now, you can vote if you are conserved. Your ability to cast a ballot, to register to vote, to cast a ballot, any of the above can and only be taken away from you by a judge. And that was changed recently before my time working within disability rights. And so for me, it's anybody who's conserved can vote. So for folks who have a little bit of the prior history knowledge, but now, absolutely, in the state of California, that is what it is.
I'll add sort of an interesting nuance to that, which is as some of the counties have been moving towards the vote center model, and in some counties, not Los Angeles, but other counties, are automatically voting every single voter a ballot. What's interesting is that there's an additional layer to that, which is allowing for, in common parlance, we're calling them pop-up voting sites. And a lot of the counties are really thinking hard about sort of where to put those pop-up voting sites, right? At places where people congregate a lot, but also at places where there's the greatest need, right? So Los Angeles County just went through a process where they said, hey, if we're going to have some of these temporary voting sites, are there places where there are centers that serve certain communities, right? Whether that's a language access community or a community that has a particular disability, right? Where we can bring a mobile voting location to that location so that it's easy for people to vote and they don't even have to kind of make a whole lot of effort to come to a vote center. But the other thing about vote centers that makes it nice is that instead of trying to schedule the disability access transit pickup, right, just for the Tuesday, because you now have up to 10 days to be able to cast that ballot at any one of a number of voting locations, it also makes planning for voting a lot easier, right? And sometimes planning for voting means having somebody who can come with you, somebody who can pick you up, somebody who can be there to bring you to the polling place or to even help you kind of go through that ballot that gets mailed to your house. Those are all really important access points that allow people with varying kinds of ability to be able to get through that election process in a way that doesn't assume that there's only one way to vote.
Hello. I was just wondering about whether you believe removing the barriers to voting will re-enfranchise those people, or extra steps need to be taken besides just kind of the structural supply side. And then how do we measure our effectiveness in taking those steps?
Yeah, so voter education is a big piece of any policy, right? Even if reforms happen, if the voter doesn't learn about their new options for voting, they're not going to be able to take advantage of that. So voter education is the next piece. It isn't just about passing policy, it's about working to make sure that voters are served by the new practices in elections. And then data collection is incredibly important in order to understand who is being served by the policies and unfortunately sometimes who is being left behind by the reforms. So working with local researchers to collect that data, I know that it is a challenge sometimes to collect data for voters with disabilities. Similarly, for African American community, this is always a question around like how do you measure in a way that's really going to be true, LGBT as well. And so for these populations, for advocates, I think it's important to partner with researchers to make sure that we get creative ways to evaluate how policies are impacting our communities.
Yeah, I heard two parts to your question, right? One is sort of beyond removing barriers, how do we just proactively increase access, right? And so let's use the voter registration as sort of one piece of that, right? Obviously, the reason why we have voter registration instituted in the US is partly grounded in our history of wanting to decide who gets included and excluded, let's be honest, right? But in California, oops, there went my glasses that helped me with my disability. But so in California, we adopted the California motor voter law, which is our version of an automatic voter registration law that works with the Department of Motor Vehicles to find out who is eligible to vote, and if they are and they have not opted out, that they're registered to vote, right? There are other kinds of proactive things that we could build into our law to really be at the forefront. To give an example, once somebody has completed serving time in prison and they've completed all other legal requirements, is there a possibility that they could simply be brought into the voter rolls because they're now eligible, as opposed to making them separately go and register? Similarly, the question that the woman asked, if you were not registered because prior law didn't allow for people under conservatorship to do that, are there ways to bring people into the voter registration rolls without making them go through an extra step of proving their eligibility? I'll take one step further, which is to ask the question, because I heard you use the word supply versus demand, and I think that's an interesting way to think about it, right? Yes, we can remove all the barriers so that it's easy for you to go to vote, but if you don't feel like you have choices on the ballot or interesting kind of races, or people aren't speaking to you, or you didn't get that extra knock on the door to kind of make you feel included, can we change the dynamics of that part of the elections? Some of the things are structural things that we can change, and I'll say that I believe that changing the way that California draws district lines has made some of those elections a lot hotter. And for once, incumbents didn't take for granted that they were a shoo-in, so they had to fight really hard. Or there are a lot more open seats, and Tony can speak to this. Some of those open seats were so hotly contested that it was no longer a given that one party or another would win. What does that mean? It means that campaigns do change their behavior, because now if they have to fight tooth and nail for every single voter, they're going to go down from the 505 voter to the 405 voter, and maybe they'll even talk to the voter who's the infrequent voter, right? They've got to get every single person as a potential voter involved, because that's how close the margins are. I think that that's healthy for our democracy. And the last piece that California has started to work on is campaign finance. One of the hardest things, and I know anybody who's ever tried to run for an office, I'm sure that Deborah Bowen, you've experienced this too. Running for office, you go in with the most noble intentions. I'm going to change this policy. This is what I care about. I care about my constituents. And all of a sudden you realize you have to pay for ads and mail and consultants, and that bill starts to add up. And where do you get that money from? Unfortunately, in California, as in most places, most of that money comes from private interests. So maybe you've got a lot of constituents who want to donate some money, but a lot of that comes from special interests. And so the way that we fund campaigns is oftentimes driven by people who have an interest in the outcome because they've got, a corporate or other business interest. So can we change that dynamic so that if we allowed for people to fundraise in a different way, would it bring in more candidates, which would bring in more vibrancy of choice, which would then change the way that campaigns behave because they feel like they got to fight for every vote. You saw that with AOC when she campaigned, because she had to fight for every vote, all of a sudden there was a much more inclusive conversation. That's what we need to figure out. How do we make every election an inclusive conversation?
Can I make a quick comment about the barriers? Because I think sometimes we tend to get ahead of ourselves trying to answer and solve all the problems. And one thing that I've come across time and time again is as you're trying to solve and remove barriers, you inherently create others. And this is a call to action for those who are interested in voting and in the elections process, is to get involved and contact your local elections office and become a member. If there is a voting accessibility advisory committee, if not, make one. You can get involved in so many different ways to ensure that maybe if this barrier was taken away, but it was created for you that nobody had even thought of, It goes way past the physical barriers and the attitudinal barriers. And so I just want to make that point that yes, we can try to solve all the barriers, but we need to be mindful and encourage voters to be involved, to be able to watch out for the new ones.
And that will, I'm sorry, that's our last question. I'm very sorry. Thanks all of you for sharing such important information and taking your time out of a busy day, I'm sure, to educate all of us on our voting rights and voter suppression and all things important. Thank you very, very much.